So it's day 3 of the Democrats' opening arguments in President Trump's impeachment trial, and it's just about to begin. Now, as I say, this is their final day. This is when the Republicans and their lawyers will have the same amount of time, 3 days, we think, in order to rebut the accusations that have been made by the Democrats, including withholding military aid to force Ukraine to dig up dirt on his rival, the former Vice President Joe Biden. President Trump denies any wrongdoing. Without more ado, let's go live to our White House correspondent, Kimberly Halkett, who is there at the White House. So, day 3, then, of the Democrats and the prosecution, if you like. Do we have any idea as to what the strategy might be? Will they just continue with what many people have said has been a fairly sort of repetitive and monotonous diatribe that has sent many of the senators to sleep?
Well, they will, because that's what they're mandated to do in the final day of arguments. The House managers meticulously making their case, which at times has been very scathing and damning for the president. The problem is, often when you're building a legal case, it's not particularly riveting television. And that has been a challenge, not just to keep the attention of the senators who act as the jurors in this trial, but also the American public. As, you know, many in the chamber are hoping to influence the outcome of the 2020 U.S. election. You have to remember that some of those senators sitting in that chamber are also running for president to replace Donald Trump. So that has even opened them up to some sort of criticism about just how objective they can really be. I think it's safe to assume this has been a partisan exercise from the beginning in many respects, and the president continuing to try and weigh in where he can as well. In the last hour, he's been tweeting the do-nothing Democrats just keep repeating and repeating over and over the same old stuff on the impeachment hoax. The president continues to try to discredit these proceedings and continues to maintain that he committed no wrongdoing, and says that he has not in any way, as the Democrats accuse, leveraged his political and presidential powers in order to try to win re-election. And
what about the oath that every senator took at the start of this this process, and that it was to be an impartial juror? And yet it seems very much as though many of the Republicans, and in fact the Democrats, have already made up their minds as to which way they would vote ultimately.
You're absolutely right. It doesn't seem, I think that dynamic could change if, in fact, and this is something that could happen next week, with not only the arguments in terms of the defense aspect of it, those lawyers who will be arguing the case on the part of President Trump, but also if we do have a bit of drama in terms of witnesses, that is still yet to be decided. But if, for example, someone like the former National Security Advisor John Bolton were to testify, something that this U.S. president has certainly pushed back on, citing executive privilege, that could certainly change the dynamic. That could not only make them more engaged, but you could see potentially some Republicans, some moderate Republicans who control that chamber, crossing over with Democrats. But right now, none of that has happened. So you're absolutely true in stating that most of them went in with their minds made up, and they haven't changed in any way. They've not been swayed. That has been the challenge for Democrats, trying to make that case. But as we've heard from our own reporters who have been inside the chamber observing, as the producers as well, there have been some that have fallen asleep. Others have been playing with little fidget spinners. So far, this has not been particularly engaging. And that is the problem for Democrats, who are ultimately seeking to remove President Trump from office after being impeached in the House of Representatives late last year.
Right. And so today, as we've said, Kimberly, is day 3 of the allotted time for the House managers to mount their case. And then that will be followed by the Republicans. Now, you were telling me earlier, Kimberly, that you thought the Republicans might not even take up the full 3 days that they are entitled to.
Absolutely right. And a couple of clues as to why we're thinking that. Number one, I went into the White House yesterday and said, are you guys going to use your full 3 days? They have 24 hours stretched over 3 days to make their case. And, well, they wouldn't fully answer the question. The source I was talking to said, you know, maybe not. We further heard from the president's own attorney, longtime personal attorney, Jay Sekulow, who spoke very publicly saying that we will use as much time as is needed. That's another signal in Washington speak that they're not going to use the full amount of time. Having said that, Martine, the source I spoke to inside the White House also told me that they can make a plan, and this has been the case from day one in Donald Trump's presidency, and then that plan is literally just thrown into the garbage the second Donald Trump changes his mind. So if he doesn't see this going the way he would like, and he certainly wants his opportunity to defend himself, they have said repeatedly from the White House side that they don't believe the president had due process or the opportunity to cross-examine or make the president's case. He's very much a thin-skinned president. He doesn't like this stain that's on him, the tarnish of impeachment that goes into the history books. So he's looking to clear his name, and he's a master at manipulating the media in terms of getting across his message. So expect that from the White House, he will be producing this very much in order to try and make his case to the American people. If he needs more time, there's that possibility that he could, in fact, take it.
All right, Kimberly, thanks for that. I think it's probably time now that we can go over to the chamber and listen.
Hearing no objection, so ordered. The Sergeant-at-Arms will make the proclamation.
Hear ye, hear ye, hear ye. All persons are commanded to keep silent on pain of imprisonment while the Senate of the United States is sitting in a trial of the articles of impeachment exhibited by the House of Representatives against Donald John Trump, President of the United States.
Chief Justice.
The Majority Leader is recognized.
For all of our colleagues, some information about scheduling. Today, we'll plan to take short breaks every 2 to 3 hours, and we'll accommodate a 30-minute recess for dinner, assuming it is needed, until the House managers have finished their opening presentation. For scheduling purposes, we've organized tomorrow's session to convene at 10 a.m. and run for several hours as the President's Council begins their presentation.
Pursuant to the provisions of Senate Resolution 483, the managers for the House of Representatives have 7 hours and 53 minutes remaining to make the presentation of their case. The Senate will now hear you.
Mr. Chief Justice, Senators, distinguished counsel of the President, I keep wanting to say good morning, but good afternoon. I just wanted to give a very brief orientation to the argument you'll hear today. We will begin with Jason Crow, who was talking about the conditionality of the military assistance. This is the latter part, although not the end of the argumentation on the application of the Constitution and law as it respects Article 1, the abuse of power. I'll have a presentation after Mr. Crow, and soon thereafter we will conclude the presentation on Article 1. We'll then begin the presentation on Article 2, once again applying the Constitution and law to the facts on the President's obstruction of Congress. We will then have some concluding thoughts and then turn it over to the President's Council. And that is what you should expect for the day. And with that, I will now yield to Mr. Crow of Colorado.
Good afternoon. I woke up this morning and walked to my local coffee shop where, unlike my esteemed colleague, Mr. Jeffries from New York, nobody complained to me about Colorado baseball. So I could only conclude that this is only a New York Yankees problem. As Mr. Schiff mentioned, we talked last night about the July 25th call and the multiple officials who had confirmed the intent of the president in withholding the aid. So now I'd like to turn to what happened around the time that the aid was lifted. And we know that the aid was lifted ultimately on September 11th, but it wasn't lifted for any legitimate reason. It was only lifted because President Trump had gotten caught. Now let's go through how we know that. On August 26th, the whistleblower complaint had been sent to the Director of National Intelligence, and public reports indicate that President Trump was told about the complaint by White House counsel Pat Cipollone. On September 5th, though, the scheme became public. An editorial in the Washington Post on that day, for the first time publicly, explicitly linked the military aid hold in the investigations that President Trump wanted. Now, keep in mind that public scrutiny of the president's hold increased exponentially after this became public. And this is where things start moving really fast. A few days later, on September 9th, the House Investigative Committees publicly announced their investigation of President's conduct in Ukraine. Lieutenant Colonel Vindman testified that the National Security Council and others at the White House learned about the investigation when it was announced. And a colleague of his said that it might have the effect of releasing the aid. And on that same day, the House Intelligence Committee learns that the administration had withheld the whistleblower complaint from Congress. The scheme was unraveling. And what happens 2 days later? President Trump released the military aid. He only released it after he got caught. But there's another reason we know the president lifted the aid only because he got caught. Because there's no other explanation. The testimony of all of the witnesses confirms it. Both Lieutenant Colonel Vindman and Ms. Williams testified that they were not provided any reason for lifting the hold. Vindman testified that nothing on the ground had changed in the 2 months of the hold, and Mark Sandy of the OMB also confirmed that. And Ambassador Taylor, too, testified that, quote, "I was not told the reason why the hold had been lifted." Now let me take a moment to address another defense I expect you will hear. That the aid was released and the investigations were never announced, so therefore, no harm, no foul, right? Well, this defense would be laughable if this issue wasn't so serious. First, I've spoken over the past 3 days about the real consequences of inserting politics into matters of war. Real people, real lives are at stake. Every day, every hour matters. So no, the delay wasn't meaningless. Just ask the Ukrainians sitting in trenches right now. And to this day, they are still waiting on $18 million of the aid that hasn't reached them. Jennifer Williams, who attended the Warsaw meeting with Vice President Pence, described President Zelensky's focus during this time.
And you testified in your deposition that in that conversation, President Zelensky emphasized that the military assistance, the security assistance, was not just important to assist Ukraine in fighting a war against Russia, but that it was also symbolic in nature. What did you understand him to mean by that?
President Zelensky explained that more than, or just equally with the financial and physical value of the assistance, that it was the symbolic nature of that assistance that really was the show of U.S. support for Ukraine and for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. And I think he was stressing that to the Vice President to really underscore the need for the security assistance to be released.
And that if the United States was holding the security assistance, is it also true then that Russia could see that as a sign of weakening U.S. support for Ukraine and take advantage of that?
I believe that's what the President Zelensky was indicating, that any signal or sign that U.S. support was wavering would be construed by Russia as potentially an opportunity for them to strengthen their own hand in Ukraine.
This is an important point, particularly when the president and his attorneys try to argue no harm, no foul. The financial assistance itself was really important to Ukraine, no question about it. But the aid was equally important as a signal to Russia of our support for Ukraine. And regardless of whether the aid was ultimately released, the fact that the hold became public sent a very clear signal to Russia that our support for Ukraine was wavering. And Russia was watching very closely for any sign of weakness. The damage was done. Now, any possible doubt about whether the aid was linked to the investigations has been erased by the president's own chief of staff. Now, we've seen this video before during the trial, but there's a really good reason for this. It's a complete admission on national TV that the military aid was conditioned on Ukraine helping the president's political campaign. Here, once again, is what Mulvaney said.
Did he also mention to me in the past the corruption related to the DNC server? Absolutely. No question about that. But that's it. And that's why we held up the money.
And when pressed that he had just confessed to the very quid pro quo that President Trump had been denying, Mulvaney doubled down.
But to be clear, what you just described is a quid pro quo. It is funding will not flow unless the investigation into the Democratic server happen as well.
We do that all the time with foreign policy. If you read the news reports and you believe them, what did McKinney say yesterday? Well, McKinney said yesterday that he was really upset with the political influence in foreign policy. That was one of the reasons he was so upset about this. And I have news for everybody. Get over it. There's going to be political influence in foreign policy. I'm talking to Mr.
Now, remember, at the time he made these statements, Mulvaney was both the head of OMB and the acting chief of staff at the White House. He knew about all of the legal concerns. He also knew about the president's so-called drug deal, as Ambassador Bolton called it. He knew exactly what was going on in the Oval Office and how OMB implemented the president's illegal order to hold the aid. Mulvaney confirmed why the president ordered the hold. It was not to develop further policy to counter Russian aggression. It was not to convince the Ukrainians to implement additional anti-corruption reforms, and it was not to pressure our allies to give more to Ukraine. Now, since we won't have an opportunity to respond to the president's presentation, I'm going to take a minute to respond to some of the arguments that I expect them to make. You will notice, I'm sure, that they will ignore significant portions of the evidence while trying to cherry-pick individual statements here and there to manufacture defenses. But don't be fooled. One defense you may hear is that the aid was held up to allow for a policy review. This is what the administration told the GAO at one point. But the evidence shows the opposite. The evidence shows that the administration didn't conduct a review at any time after the president ordered the hold. Laura Cooper was not aware of any review of the funding conducted by DOD in July, August, or September. And similarly, George Kent testified that the State Department did not conduct and was never asked to conduct a review of funding administered by the State Department. In fact, on May 23rd, the anti-corruption review was complete and DOD certified to Congress that Ukraine had complied with all of the conditions and that the remaining half of the aid should be released. This was confirmed by the June 18th press release announcing the release or announcing the funding. And do you remember the fictitious, quote-unquote, interagency review process? Well, that was made up, too. So no review was necessary because it had already been done. Next, the President's counsel keeps saying this was about corruption in Ukraine. President Trump was not concerned with fighting corruption. It's difficult to even say that with a straight face. The president never mentioned corruption on either call with President Zelensky. But let's go through the evidence. As we just discussed, DOD had already completed a review and concluded that Ukraine had, quote, made sufficient progress in meeting defense reform and anti-corruption goals consistent with the National Defense Authorization Act in order to receive the funds. And in fact, Mark Sandy, who was not at that meeting, but who was initially responsible for approving the hold, said he had never heard corruption as a reason for the hold in all of the discussions he had about it. Similar to the anti-corruption argument, there is simply no evidence to support the president's after-the-fact argument that he was concerned about burden sharing. Now, that's other countries also contributing to Ukraine. I imagine the president may cite the emails in June about what other countries provided to Ukraine, the reference to other countries' contributions in the July 25th call, and testimony from Sandy about a request for information about what other European countries give to Ukraine. But there is simply no evidence that ties the concern to his decision to hold the funding. First, let's actually look at the contributions of European countries to Ukraine.
All right, we're going to leave the Republican Senator Jason Crow of Colorado as he meticulously outlines his case, giving a contextual account of the geopolitics and of the consequences, if you like, of the withholding of the aid. This is just maybe the first 15 minutes or so of the 7 hours and 53 minutes that remain for the Democrats to make their case. Their aim, of course, to persuade some of those Republicans, enough of those Republicans, to reconsider their support for President Trump. So we'll leave that and move on to some other news.
In the Trump administration mentioned